Good evening. Tonight I'm going to talk about the Jungian transformation of Michael Cohen. This is not going to be a political discussion. It's only going to be a discussion of the monopersonality and what Michael Cohen was up against in his lifetime. And then I'm going to talk about his sentencing statement the other day and talk about how that relates to some things we know. But before I begin, in order to give the group time to start, and good evening, Mr. Krishnamurti. Do you speak or write Korean? That looks like Korean to me that's on the screen. Can you hear me? I hope. Oh, hi, Mark and Terry. Welcome. You're here early. We have a couple of things going before we get to Michael Cohen. I know that you're interested in that one, but let me first mention that things are changing in the religions, at least in the United States. And so I'm just going to talk about this a little as we warm up and let a few people join the live stream. On Saturday or Sunday, it so happens I went to church, which I rarely do. My attitude about church is very much similar to that of Dr. Jung's. But I was very surprised to find on the program this mandala. And there was actually a lovely, let's see here, just a second. There was actually a lovely statement connected with it. And so I thought I'd mention that. And so let me get myself back up on the screen. And so on the back of the program, there's this statement called About the Art. And this is called Thread of Creation by Lauren Wright Pittman from John 1 through 14. Now that reference, just so you know, is the reference that begins, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. So I'm not going to read that whole section, but that is John 1 through 14. And I just wanted to read to you what Ms. Pittman wrote about her mandala. In the past, I have met this text and spiraled out in my own grief and anxiety. Previously in my reading, these apocalyptic signs pointed to my own smallness, fragility, and mortality, stirring up fear and confusion. This year, however, for me, these signs boldly point to the unfathomable, overwhelming greatness of God. This text feels massive, and it invites us into this Advent season in a thundering fashion. Jesus says, let me put it back up on the screen here for a moment. This is most appropriate. Okay, so going on. Jesus says to respond to these apocalyptic signs with staggering hope and confidence. When it feels like the very foundations of the heavens are crumbling, we are to stand up. When the roaring sea and waves confuse us, when the sun, the moon, and stars come tumbling out of the sky, we are to raise our hands. We are to raise our heads. When the news cycle feels like an endless fire hose, people pour into the streets in protest. Families are separated and fires blaze through neighborhoods. We are to stand up and confidently usher in and claim the redemption that God promises. Just as the trees signal the changing of the seasons, these signs will prepare us for the coming of Christ. Instead of getting lost in the worries of this life, stand up, raise your head, and get lost in the fact of this expansive, infinite God is drawing near to you. Choose to get lost in wonder. Okay, so, and as we know, this image, or various mandalas, represent the self and the God image in Jungian psychology, so I thought I'd just add that to it. And so you can go back. I will put these images that I use tonight, if I use any, in the Dropbox so that you can get them later if you like. Good evening, Tor. So I want to take special note of the presence of my friends from Simply Basic Software. This is a couple, and the woman of this couple I've known since 1962, and so I'm especially honored that she's here today with her husband, Mark. Thank you for being here tonight. Now, one more thing as we warm up. I want to go back and read once more for you this short excerpt from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. And as many of you know, I have read this entire book into the channel in the last week. And so you can find it there. But I felt that this particular section is particularly important to us in our society, and it is relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So Dr. Jung has been talking about neurosis, and he says, if for person we substitute modern society, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental dissociation, i.e., a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, it does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens in every neurotic psyche, to its own deep distress, and it is just this distress that brings the patient to the doctor. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have perplexed the reader, the doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves of the patient's personality, because only from them both, and not merely from one half, with the suppression of the other, can he put together a whole and complete man. And so I'll just leave it at that. That reading is from chapter 5, and it's on page 74 of The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. And so tonight I've pulled together a number of things for you which will lead up to the sentencing statement that Michael Cohen made the other day, last Wednesday, before his sentencing in federal court. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, or I'm going to try to avoid it, but rather talk about Mr. Cohen in a compassionate way and try to help understand the situation that he was and is in, and how it may be that he came to make the statement that he did, which was quite interesting to me, because as I listened to it on television last Wednesday evening, I said, oh my goodness, that sounds very Jungian. And so I did pull some things together. And so first of all, I want to read from, this is from Principles of Practical Psychotherapy, The Practice of Psychotherapy, Volume 16, of the collected works, and I'm reading from paragraphs 3 and 4. And Dr. Jung is talking about suggestive methods of psychotherapy, and he says, to the extent that the insignificance of the individual is a truth, suggestive methods, technical procedures, and theorems in any shape or form are entirely capable of success and guarantee results with the universal man, as for instance, Christian Science, mental healing, faith cures, remedial training, medical and religious techniques, and countless other isms. Even political movements can, not without justice, claim to be psychotherapy in the grand manner. The outbreak of war cured many a compulsion neurosis, and from time immemorial, certain miraculous localities have caused neurotic states to disappear. Similarly, popular movements, both large and small, can exert a curative influence on the individual. By curative influence, I presume we're talking about a psychological cure. Paragraph 4. This fact finds the simplest and most nearly perfect expression in the primitive idea of mana. Mana is a universal medicinal or healing power which renders men, animals, and plants fruitful and endows chieftain and medicine man with magical strength. Mana, as Lehman has shown, is identified with anything extraordinarily potent, or simply with anything impressive. On the primitive level, anything impressive is therefore medicine, since it is notorious that 100 intelligent heads massed together make one big fat head. Virtues and endowments are essentially the hallmarks of the individual and not of the universal man. The mass is always inclined to herd psychology, hence they are easily stampeded, and to mob psychology, hence their witless brutality and hysterical emotionalism. So I'll leave that particular part of the reading at that point. And now I want to go to one of Dr. Jung's early essays, which are found in 2 essays on analytical psychology. This is volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And here there's an essay entitled Mana Personality, and I just want to give you a sense of it. He's talking about the fact that anima can be a mana personality, and so if we think of our president as having in the past been possessed by anima, and every man in the audience can imagine that there is some beautiful model or whoever who attracts our attention, and it might be our wife, but it might be a movie star, whoever. But once you've brought that anima into yourself and integrated her into your life, then you own her power. And so anyway, I'm going to read a brief excerpt on this, which relates to anima. My initial material for the discussion that now follows, I'm at paragraph 374 in this essay called The Mana Personality. My initial material for the discussion that now follows is taken from cases where the condition that was presented in the previous chapter as the immediate goal has been achieved, namely the conquest of the anima as an autonomous complex and her transformation into a function of relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. With the attainment of this goal, it becomes possible to disengage the ego from all its entanglements with collectivity and the collective unconscious. Through this process, the anima forfeits the demonic power of an autonomous complex. She can no longer exercise the power of possession, since she is depotentiated. She is no longer the guardian of treasures unknown, no longer Kundri, demonic messenger of the Grail, half divine and half animal. No longer is the soul called a mistress, but a psychological function of an intuitive nature, akin to what the primitives mean when they say, "He has gone into the forest to talk with the spirits," or "My snake spoke with me," or, in the mythological language of infancy, "A little bird told me." Those of my readers who know writer Haggard's description of she who must be obeyed, this is from a book entitled She, by writer Haggard. Those of my readers who know writer Haggard's description of she who must be obeyed will surely recall the magical power of this personality. She is a mana personality, a being full of some occult and bewitching quality, mana, endowed with magical knowledge and power. All these attributes naturally have their source in the naive projection of an unconscious self-knowledge which, expressed in less poetic terms, would run somewhat as follows. I recognize that there is some psychic factor active in me which eludes my conscious will in the most incredible manner. It can put extraordinary ideas into my head, induce in me unwanted and unwelcome moods and emotions, lead me to astonishing actions for which I can accept no responsibility, upset my relations with other people in a very irritating way. I feel powerless against this fact, and what is worse, I am in love with it, so that all I can do is marvel. Okay, well, one thing I would say about this to Terry is we had a reunion 30 years after we graduated from high school, so in 1992, and on the Saturday night of that reunion, when I went to bed that night, I burst into sobbing because I realized that I had been in love with all of the girls in the high school. and they all carried my anima in some way. And so somehow that outburst then allowed me to somewhat analyze the situation, and fortunately I was far enough into my Jungian work so that I didn't feel powerless, and it didn't cause me to make any irritating mistakes and upset my relations, but it was quite an experience. But anyway, that brings us now, so that's the power of a mana personality that I wanted to get to. And then I want to go back later in this paragraph, or in this essay, 20 pages later, to paragraph 395. And here we meet up with the experience that must have been the case for Mr. Cohen, because I think that Mr. Cohen might have been, how should we say, overtaken by the mana personality of our president. And so here's what Dr. Jung says. On psychological grounds, therefore, I would recommend that no God be constructed out of the archetype of the mana personality. In other words, he must not be concretized, for only thus can I avoid projecting my values and non-values into God and the devil, and only thus can I preserve my human dignity, my specific gravity, which I need so much if I am not to become the unresisting shuttlecock of unconscious forces. In his dealings with the visible world, a man must certainly be mad to suppose that he is the master of his world. Here we follow quite naturally the principle of non-resistance to all superior forces up to a certain personal individual limit, beyond which the most peaceful citizen becomes a bloody revolutionary. So what we have seen in Michael Cohen's performance over the last few months is the bloody revolutionary. He was stuck under the monopersonality for something like a decade, according to news reports, and but somehow the monopersonality didn't recognize his contributions adequately, and so he reached his certain individual limit and therefore has become metaphorically a bloody revolutionary in the form of saying, well, if you're not going to take care of me, boss, I'm going to take you down. And so that's what seems to be happening. Now I want to go over to Mysterium Conjunctionis, and this is the big one. So just to give you an appreciation of what the great tome is about. And I want to talk again about monopersonalities, but this is in part of the essay entitled The Conjunction, and I'm reading from paragraphs 782 to 785. Nothing provides a better demonstration of the extreme uncertainty of metaphysical assertions than their diversity. But it would be completely wrong to assume that they are altogether worthless. For in the end, it has to be explained why such assertions are made at all. There must be some reason for this. Somehow men feel impelled to make transcendental statements. Why this should be so is a matter for dispute. We only know that in genuine cases it is not a question of arbitrary inventions, but of involuntary numinous experiences which happen to a man and provide the basis for religious assertions and convictions. Assertions like, I would take a bullet for Donald Trump, as Mr. Cohen has said. Therefore, at the source of the great confessional religions, as well as many smaller mystical movements, we find individual historical personalities whose lives were distinguished by numinous experiences. Numerous investigations of such experiences have convinced me that previously unconscious contents then break through into consciousness and overwhelm it in the same way as the invasions of the unconscious in pathological cases accessible to psychiatric observation. Even Jesus, according to Mark 3:21, appeared to his followers in that light. The significant difference, however, between mere pathological cases and the inspired personalities is that sooner or later the latter find an extensive following and can therefore transmit their effect down the centuries. The fact that the long-lasting effect exerted by the founders of the great religions is due quite as much to their overwhelming spiritual personality, their exemplary life, and their ethical self-commitment does not affect the present discussion. Personality is only one route of success, and there were, and always will be, genuine religious personalities to whom success is denied. One has only to think of Meister Eckhart. But if they do meet with success, this only proves that the truth they utter hits on a consensus of opinion. that they are talking of something that is in the air and is spoken from the heart for their followers too. This, as we know to our cost, applies to good and evil alike, to the true as well as the untrue. Now here's the kicker paragraph, paragraph 783. The wise man who is not heeded is counted as a fool, and the fool who proclaims the general folly first and loudest passes for a prophet and furor. And sometimes it is luckily the other way around as well, or else mankind would long since have perished of stupidity. I'll read that once more. The wise man who is not heeded is counted as a fool, and the fool who proclaims the general folly first and loudest passes for a prophet and furor. And sometimes it is luckily the other way around as well, or else mankind would long since have perished of stupidity. The insane person, whose distinguishing mark is his mental sterility, expresses no truth, not only because he is not a personality, but because he meets with no consensus of opinion. But anyone who does has to that extent expressed the truth. In metaphysical matters, what is authoritative is true. Hence, metaphysical assertions are invariably bound up with an unusually strong claim to recognition and authority, because authority is for them the only possible proof of their truth. And by this proof they stand or fall. All metaphysical claims in this respect inevitably beg the question, as is obvious to any reasonable person in the case of proofs of God. The claim to authority is naturally not in itself sufficient to establish a metaphysical truth. Its authority must also be backed by an equally vehement need of the multitude. As this need always arises from a condition of distress, any attempt at explanation will have to examine the psychic situation of those who allow themselves to be convinced by a metaphysical assertion. It will then turn out that the statements of the inspired personality have made conscious just those images and ideas which compensate the general psychic distress. These images and ideas were not thought up or invented by the inspired personality, but happened to him as experiences, and he became, as it were, their willing or unwilling victim. A will transcending his consciousness seized hold of him, which he was quite unable to resist. Naturally enough, he feels this overwhelming power as divine. So here we meet with our president, who thinks that he is the only one who can get anything done. And we also meet some people that are persuaded by him. And, he's very proud of the fact that he still has 34% approval rating among his base. But I would just observe that just as Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And so what we are seeing is in this 34% that you can fool some of the people all of the time. Now, the next thing I wanted to get into, so this is just a sort of a general background idea of monopersonality. And of course, our president has a version of that, and Mr. Cohen was certainly taken in by our president's version of that. And so he recognized that he was taken in. And so in his sentencing statement, he made reference to a book by another psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, called Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl was a Jewish doctor. He was a psychiatrist in the first half of the 20th century to begin with. And he was already a psychiatrist when he was captured by the Nazis. And he spent 3 years in 4 of the worst prison camps of the Nazi era. And when he came out in 1945, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days, in one go. And so good evening to everybody, and hello to New Zealand. And so I want to refer that to you. As you see, when I heard Michael Cohen use the reference to Viktor Frankl's book, I already had it on my shelf, and so I thought that I would bring to your attention some of the key points, which are very Jungian sounding, and they are also very much related to the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous, which we discussed in previous sessions as being sort of following the spirit of Dr. Jung, let's say. It wasn't his brainchild per se, it was Bill W.'s brainchild, but it was based on some guidance that Dr. Jung had given. Okay, I'm going to stay off of the chat for the moment because I need to get through these basic ideas, and then I will come back. Also, I will mention that I do have Super Chat available, which is the little dollar sign underneath the chat thing. And if any of you feel motivated to buy me a couple of ounces of coffee at some point, I would certainly welcome your Super Chats. I'm somewhat like... I feel somewhat like the young woman in San Diego who worked very hard on building up her YouTube channel, and then YouTube changed the rules, and she went up to YouTube headquarters and started shooting because she had worked so hard to build up her YouTube channel. And I did that also, and only to find out when I finally did achieve the level of performance required by YouTube, that which is you must have 1,000 followers, subscribers, and your subscribers have to have viewed your videos for more than 4,000 hours in the last 12 months. And so that's quite a requirement for people who are writing 3-minute songs to achieve. And so they're understandably upset and not realizing, which I now realize, that now with nearly 3,000 followers, it's actually going to turn 2,900 tonight, I believe, with 3,000 followers and over 800 videos now, and a loyal following here on Monday nights. I'm making about 80 cents a day on YouTube on advertising, so it's not a big payback. Anyway, but I'm not doing it for that reason, but certainly a coffee here and there wouldn't hurt. Anyway, so Viktor Frankl had, as I said, been in 4 concentration camps, and he survived. He found ways to survive. And so he talked about meaning being essential. And of course, this was central to Dr. Jung's oeuvre as well, where Dr. Jung often talked about the need for meaning in humanity. And so Frankel mentioned 3 ways that you can have meaning in your life. One is by creating a work or doing a deed. I'm reading from page 104 of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So he says one is by creating a work or doing a deed. And that, I would say, comes from the logos side of the equation. 2 is by experiencing something or encountering someone. And he refers to this as love. And that comes from the eros side of the equation. And then 3, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. And so when we do have to suffer for some reason, whether it's the death of a parent or something like that, if we face that courageously, then that gives our lives meaning. And let's see, there's another reference to this, so let me read that. And I'll just read this right through. Page 137 of Dr. Frankel's book. There are 3 main avenues on which one arrives at meaning in life. The first is by creating a work or by doing a deed. The second is by experiencing something or encountering someone. In other words, meaning can be found not only in work, but also in love. Edith Weishaupt-Jolson observed in this context that the logotherapeutic notion that experiencing can be as valuable as achieving is therapeutic because it compensates for our one-sided emphasis on the external world of achievement at the expense of the internal world of experience. Most important, however, is the third avenue of meaning in life. Even the helpless victim of a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and by so doing, change himself. He may turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. Again, it was Edith Weishaupt-Jolson who, as mentioned on page 107, once expressed the hope that logotherapy may help counteract certain unhealthy trends in the present-day culture of the United States, where the incurable sufferer is given very little opportunity to be proud of his suffering or to consider it ennobling rather than degrading, so that he is not only unhappy, but also ashamed of being unhappy. Okay, so that is that. And then he refers to kind of, in the context of attitude, he's talking about the defiant power of the human spirit. And one example I would give, he's given several here in his book, but one example I would give is Stephen Hawking, who, when he was in his early 20s, had ALS cripple him, and nonetheless he was able to make a major mark in cosmology and physics throughout a life that he lived for a very long time under very difficult situation. And there are some other examples here. So one of the pieces of advice he says is, if suffering is avoidable, then remove the cause of the suffering. If not, choose your attitude about it. Okay, so the point is that if you're suffering, you need to have an attitude about it or remove the cause of the suffering. And this has certainly come up in my lifetime in this way. And then in terms of finding meaning, Dr. Frankel makes the sensible suggestion that you think of your life as a movie, because, as he says, each frame of the movie has a meaning unto itself. And so in each moment, you can find the meaning in that moment. And it's only at the end of the movie that you know the overall meaning of your life, but you only know that because of all these individual frames at the rate of 30 or 60 a second, as you know. And then he points out that conscience applies a measuring stick to each life situation. And he points out that this is anchored in biological heritage, instinct, in other words, eros. Thank you so much, Thomas. I appreciate your gift. Thank you so much. And so I think we could say that Mr. Cohen did have a twinge of conscience come upon him. And this is what Dr. Jung was getting at when he started talking about the instinctual side of life and the eros side of life being important. And it's in the biological heritage. And then on page 141, Dr. Frankel makes another terrific suggestion, which is, live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you are about to act now. So it's a little difficult to follow that sentence, but let me just read it to you one more time. Live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you are about to act now. So this presumes that whatever you're going to do today or tomorrow is the wrong thing to do. But if you imagine that you get a second chance, maybe you should change, I suppose. Now, Dr. Frankl concludes with an interesting observation about Freud. And he says, and this is on page 144 and 145 of the official text of the book, he says, Sigmund Freud once asserted, let one attempt to expose a number of the most diverse people uniformly to hunger. With the increase of the imperative urge of hunger, all individual differences will blur, and in their stead will appear the uniform expression of the one unstilled urge. Thank heaven Sigmund Freud was spared knowing the concentration camps from the inside. His subjects lay on a couch designed in the plush style of Victorian culture, not in the filth of Auschwitz. There, the individual differences did not blur, but on the contrary, people became more different. People unmasked themselves, both the swine and the saints. And today you need no longer hesitate to use the word saints. Think of Father Maximilian Kolbe, who was starved and finally murdered by an injection of carbolic acid at Auschwitz, and who in 1983 was canonized. You may be prone to blame me for invoking examples that are the exceptions to the rule, but everything great is just as difficult to realize as it is rare to find, reads the last sentence of the Ethics of Spinoza. You may, of course, ask whether we really need to refer to saints. Wouldn't it suffice just to refer to decent people? It is true that they form a minority. More than that, they always will remain a minority. And yet I see therein the very challenge to join the minority, for the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best. And then he concludes, so let us be alert in a twofold sense. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of. And since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. And then there's, in the back of this book, this is a commemorative book because this is the 100th printing of Dr. Frankel's book. And in the back of it are added some speeches. And so Dr. Frankl had a couple of other things to say. 30 years ago, on the 50th anniversary of the invasion of the Nazis into Austria, he was asked to give a talk. So this is his 50th anniversary talk, and I'm near the end of it. It's on page 179 of my copy of this book. National Socialism nurtured racism. In reality, there are only two races, namely the race of decent people and the race of people who are not decent. And segregation runs straight through all nations and within every single nation, straight through all parties. Even in the concentration camps, one came across halfway decent fellows here and there among the SS men, just as one came across the odd scoundrel or two among the prisoners, not to mention the capos. That decent people are in the minority, that they have always been a minority and are likely to remain so, is something we must come to terms with. Danger only threatens when a political system sends those not decent people, i.e. the negative element of a nation, to the top. And no nation is immune from doing this, and in this respect, every nation is in principle capable of a holocaust. In support of this, we have the sensational results of scientific experiments in the field of social psychology, for which we owe thanks to an American. They are known as the Milgram experiment. And I would urge you to take a look at the Milgram experiment on Wikipedia. I looked it up, and it's about how people will do the darndest things that you wouldn't expect. And it's been proven over and over again. I'll put into the chat the name so that you don't miss it. Okay. So then he concludes. If we want to extract the political consequences from all this, we should assume that there are basically only two styles of politics, or perhaps better said, only two types of politicians. The first are those who believe that the end justifies the means, and that could be any means, while the other type of politician knows very well that there are means that could desecrate the holiest end. And it is this type of politician whom I trust, despite the clamor around the year 1988 and the demands of the day, not to mention the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the invasion into Vienna, trust to hear the voice of reason and to ensure that all who are of good will stretch out their hands to each other across all the graves and across all divisions. Sorry. Now let me read that more clearly once I get control of myself. While the other type of politician knows very well that there are means that could desecrate the holiest end. And it is this type of politician whom I trust, despite the clamor and the demands of the day, not to mention of the anniversary. Trust to hear the voice of reason and to ensure that all who are of good will stretch out their hands to each other across all the graves and across all divisions. Thanks for your attention. Okay, so let me go back before I go into Michael Cohen's talk, and it's only one page, but it so happens that in it he mentions Viktor Frankl's book, which is why I read so much about it, and also about monopersonality. But it struck me that that he hit upon many of the 12 steps, as we find in Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous, and the official 12 steps of AA. And so I pulled out the 12 steps as I was reading Mr. Cohen's statement. And lo and behold, I found all 12. And so that is interesting. But let me go back and see what you have been saying. Isaiah said that looks like a compass. He's referring to earlier on in this conversation when I was showing a mandala. Hello to Ian, Shekina. Thomas says, I always loved that Abe quote. Bob Dylan quotes it sort of in Talking World War III Blues. Right, absolutely. Thomas says, half the people can be part right all the time. Some of the people can be all right part of the time, but all the people can't all be right all of the time. I think Abraham Lincoln said that. Okay, I wasn't there, but that's the general idea. And Ian says, Trump doesn't drink, right? I think that's true, and that's an interesting fact. I have never heard that he is involved with AA, but I know that his brother died of alcoholism, and that's probably the reason. Ian said, Shekina says, I found out I have Jewish blood through my father's lineage, Gentile as though. And, well, I suppose most people have Jewish blood somewhere. My father used to joke that, he said that everybody in the Western world is related to Alexander the Great. And so that's probably true. And so we're all probably related to the Jews from the time of Jesus. Thomas says, Frankel was the founder of that logotherapy school, right? And I say yes. And as I read about the logotherapy school, I realized more and more that it basically tracks with Jungian psychology. Now, in his book, in this book, and I'll just make an observation, it's not really worth much, but in his book, he mentions Freud and Adler, but he does not mention Jung. And I thought about that and when this book was written, and I think immediately after World War II, many Jews thought that Dr. Jung was a collaborator with the Nazis, which he was not. But many Jews thought so. And so I think that Dr. Frankel's logotherapy essentially tracks Jungian psychology, but of course a lot of Jung's work related to Christianity, so Dr. Frankel tracked it over into a more generic area, and he called it logotherapy. And I have no objection to that, because there were certainly a lot of hard feelings, and Dr. Frankel lost many relatives during the war in the concentration camps, plus he had a horrific experience himself. And I think that if he and Dr. Jung met at some later time, they might get along quite well, because their philosophies and their approach to psychology seems to track very well. But nonetheless, Viktor Frankl doesn't mention Dr. Jung in his book, and of course neither does Michael Cohen, although Michael Cohen does basically track the 12 steps of AA. And so thank you, Simply Basic Software, for your gift, your Christmas gift. Okay, so anyway, now let me go directly to Michael Cohen's statement, and you can see what I mean. And again, I'm not making any value judgment about whether Michael Cohen is a good or a bad person, whether he's reformed or not, or whether he deserved his sentence or not. And nor am I making any observation about what he may or may not have done for the president. What I am doing is just observing his transformation, as it seemed to me as I listened to it on the television last Wednesday evening, which seems to track a Jungian style of transformation. And it does track the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so even though Viktor Frankl didn't mention Dr. Jung, and neither did Mr. Cohen, Mr. Cohen did seem to track the 12 steps. And so let me just give you that observation. Thomas says, I watched a movie about the Milgram experiment recently, The Experiment, the famous experiment that seemed to prove just how far people would go following a leader. And it was horrifying. Yep, it's pretty horrifying. And basically what they found was that some huge percentage of people, like 92%, would give in an experiment would give people a lethal dose of electrical shock. Okay, so I'm taking this statement from NBC News, and the headline of it is, "Read Michael Cohen's full sentencing statement and why blind loyalty to Trump was the biggest mistake of his life." Now, mind you, in my perspective, and that's why I talked about monopersonality early in this discussion, I think he was under the influence of a monopersonality. And so he says, okay, and I'm going to drift back and forth between the 12 steps and what he says. "I stand before your honor humbly and painfully aware that we are here today for one reason, because of my actions that I pled guilty to on August 21st and as well on November 29. Okay, so this is step one. Step one reads, "We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable." Okay, so this was his admission, and obviously this admission does not relate in any way to alcoholism. It relates to being overwhelmed by a monopersonality, in my view. Okay, so paragraph 2. "I take full responsibility for each act that I pled guilty to, the personal ones to me and those involving the President of the United States. Viktor Frankl, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, 'There are forces beyond your control that can take away everything you possess except one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation.'" Now, this is Dr. Frankel's reference to the frames of a movie, and it relates to step 3, which is, "Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him." Your Honor, this may seem hard to believe, but today is one of the most meaningful days of my life. The irony is today is the day I am getting my freedom back. I am getting my freedom back as you sit at the bench and you contemplate my fate. Now, this relates to number 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Okay, so here he's referring to the court as a power greater than himself that may restore him. "I have been living in a personal and mental incarceration ever since the fateful day that I accepted the offer to work for a famous real estate mogul whose business acumen I truly admired. In fact, I now know that there is little to be admired. I want to be clear. I blame myself for the conduct which has brought me here today, and it was my own weakness and a blind loyalty to this man that led me to choose a path of darkness over light. It is for these reasons I chose to participate in the illicit act of the president rather than to listen to my own inner voice, which should have warned me that the campaign finance violations that I later pled guilty to were insidious." Now, obviously, this reference to the inner voice is a reference to the self or the God image, and it relates also to step 5 of the 12 steps, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Recently, the president tweeted a statement calling me weak, and he was correct, but for a much different reason than he was implying. It was because time and time again I felt it was my duty to cover up his dirty deeds rather than to listen to my own inner voice and my moral compass. My weakness can be characterized as a blind loyalty to Donald Trump, and I was weak for not having the strength to question and to refuse his demands. I have already spent years living a personal and mental incarceration, which no matter what is decided today, owning this mistake will free me to be once more the person I really am. And so this is step number 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And of course, he's referring again to conscience, which is the inner voice, and it's the instinctual voice that we have within us. Then we get to a paragraph that has 3 in it. It's a very short paragraph, but it gets 3. Your Honor, I love my family more than anything in the world. My dad is here today. My mom, my in-laws, siblings, love of my life, my wife Laura, my pride and joy, my daughter Samantha, and my son Jake. There is no sentence that could supersede the suffering that I live with on a daily basis, knowing that my actions have brought undeserved pain and shame upon my family. I deserve that pain. They do not. And so this relates to steps 5, 8, and 9 at least. So admitted to God, or in this case to the court, to ourselves and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. And then 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Okay, then going into the next paragraph, I also stand before my children for them to see their father taking responsibility for his mistakes that have forced them to bear a shameful spotlight which they have done nothing to deserve, and this breaks my heart. For me, the greatest punishment has been seeing the unbearable pain that my actions and my associations have brought to my entire family. My mom, my dad, this isn't what they deserve to see in their older age, especially when as a child they emphasized to all of us the difference between right and wrong. I am sorry. Now this goes to step 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings and apologize. Okay. I'll skip a couple of paragraphs, but then he says, for months now, the President of the United States, one of the most powerful men in the world, publicly mocks me, calling me a rat and a liar, and insists that the court sentence me to the absolute maximum time in prison. Not only is this improper, it creates a false sense that the president can weigh in on the outcome of judicial proceedings that implicate him. Despite being vilified by the press and inundated with character assassinations over the past almost 2 years, I still stand today and am committed to proving my integrity and ensuring that history will not remember me as the villain of his story. I now know that every action I take in the future has to be well thought out and with honorable intention, because I wish to leave no room for future mistakes in my life. And so this relates to steps 10 and 11. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. And number 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contract with God as we understood him. praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. So obviously he's at least meditating on the honorable intention. And let's see. So I beseech your honor to consider this path that I am currently taking when sentencing me today, and I want to apologize to my entire family for what my actions have put them through. My family has suffered immeasurably in the home and the world outside. I know I have let them all down, and it will be my life's work to make it right and to become the best version of myself. Most of all, I want to apologize to the people of the United States, who you deserve to know the truth, and lying to you was unjust. I want to thank you, Your Honor, for all the time I'm sure you've committed to this matter and the consideration that you have given to my future. And this relates again to step 1 and step 12. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends on AA unity. That's 12 traditions. Going back to number 1 of the 12 steps, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. But in this case, he was powerless over a mana personality. And number 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. So it remains to be seen, of course, whether Michael Cohen can live up to his statement to the judge. I think we can all hope that he will and can. And so I guess there ought to be a 12-step program for people that are sucked into a mana personality. At least that's my view. But anyway, Shakina says, I'd donate if I could, but okay, well, don't worry about that. Thomas says, my name is Bill by Susan Cheever. It's a great book on Bill W. and the evolution of AA. Highly recommended. Bill tried LSD toward the end of his life in his 70s. Not a neatly tied up life. And Thomas says, spot on tie-in vis-a-vis Cohen and the 12 steps. Skip, well done. Okay, thank you. I'm glad I achieved my purpose. At least I have a accolade there. This was a bit challenging to pull all of this together because many of these ideas are very widely spread across Dr. Jung's oeuvre, and he certainly had a lot to say about mana personalities. And so then I want to go back, I guess. Let me go back to this one point here. So paragraph 783 and 784 of Mysterium Conjunctionis. 783, the wise man who is not heeded is counted a fool, and the fool who proclaims the general folly first and loudest passes as a prophet and Führer. And sometimes it is luckily the other way around as well, or else mankind would long since have perished of stupidity. And then 784, the insane person whose distinguishing mark is his mental sterility expresses no truth, not only because he is not a personality, but because he meets with no consensus of opinion. But anyone who does has to that extent expressed the truth. In metaphysical matters, what is authoritative is true. Hence, metaphysical assertions are invariably bound up with an unusually strong claim to recognition and authority, because authority is for them the only possible proof of their truth, and by this proof they stand or fall. All metaphysical claims in this respect inevitably beg the question, as is obvious to any reasonable person in the case of the proofs of God. And so we've been having our local international monopersonality expressing himself quite broadly over the airways across the world. And so the question is, will he be able to, as Dr. Jung says, let's see, the significant difference, however, between merely pathological cases and inspired personalities is that sooner or later the latter find an extensive following and can therefore transmit their effect down the centuries. So I ask you if a century from now our president has transmitted his truth, that he is the only one that can solve our problems, whether he will have transmitted his truth down the centuries. And if you don't think that's the case, then maybe he's in trouble. That's what I think. Yeah, it's a close reading. So thank you, Kay, for your thought. Any other things that you want to talk about tonight? Or any comments or questions about the monopersonality? Okay, let's see. There's one other thing. This is on a completely different topic, but it's a question that has come to my mind. And mind you, at some point about 4 or 5 years ago, I came to the opinion that the Red Book shouldn't be called Liber Novus, because Liber Novus was simply a printer's mark that was on the book. And I've been looking at pictures of the Red Book ever since and trying to find where I saw that. And finally, this morning, I found it in this book, C.G. Jung, A Biography in Books by Sona Shamdasani. And I'll explain why this is significant in a moment here, but let me see if we can find the picture. So this is the picture. I'll give you a better view of it here in a moment. Brandon, I'll give you an answer to that question in a minute. But let me go back here for a sec. Okay, so that picture has this embossing on the book. Now, this book was always intended as a scrapbook by the publisher of it, and Dr. Jung received it as a scrapbook and then put into it his calligraphy and his paintings and so on. But as I look at this image, to me, the words Liber Novus look like they were put there by the printer himself, and it only means new book. And if you buy a diary at Barnes & Noble this week, very likely it will have some sort of printing like that on it. And so lately I've heard a number of people suggesting that Dr. Jung had Liber Novus put on the book because he envisioned it as the beginning of a new religion, and I don't think that that's what he envisioned at all. And in fact, he denied that throughout his lifetime. And so, but the place you can get a comparison is underneath this video. In the description of this video, you'll find a link to the scanning company that scanned the Red Book. And in the images that they show in that short video, 3 minutes, I do not see the words Liber Novus on the book that came out of the vault. And as I carefully compare, let me put it back up there for a moment. If you look at the gold around the corners of this book spine, if you carefully compare those in this picture, which were in Dr. Shamdasani's book, with the images that come out in the video, they don't look like the same book. And so I've wondered about this for a long time. I don't have any proof one way or another. My instinct tells me that this was not Dr. Jung that put that term in the book or on the spine of the book. And because he was very humble about what he was trying to do as he got into his later work related primarily to the Christian religion. But there seem to be some who want to refer to the book as if it's the New Testament. And to me, that's revisionist history, and that's not what Dr. Jung was trying to do or was about at all. So if any of you are familiar with the original and have any other comparisons to look at, there are various pictures of the Red Book, the original Red Book, around. These are the only 2 examples I've found, but in the picture that I showed on this video now, that looks like Liber Novus was put there by the original book creator and not as an afterthought, and at least to me. And the book that comes out of the vault in the short video that the link is underneath this video does not appear to have those words on it. And the spine of that book, which comes out of the vault, is very subtly different from the spine of the book that is in the picture that I just showed you. So if any of you have an opinion on that, please let me know. Thomas says, Jung wrote new book on the spine, right? That's what I'm saying. I don't think so. And Shakina says, do you think maybe Trump is the shadow of America? I surely think that. I think that this, what we see when 34% of the American population is still supporting the president, that represents the shadow of America. And it's, the same, the Abraham Lincoln quote, you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. And I think that that's Abraham Lincoln's quote, and I think that it is quite clearly playing out in American politics, that some people are under his spell as a mono-personality. And so, Thomas, the question about whether Jung had that embossment put there, or the publisher. I doubt if we'll ever answer that question, but I'm asking it anyway. I'm making it an issue so that some other Jungians may opine on that point. Yes, it was the color alone, but also, interestingly, there are several books which mention a red book. One is Lord of the Rings, which Becca Tarnas talks about in her comparison between the Red Book and Lord of the Rings. When she did her talk at the Library of Congress, she's now written her PhD thesis on that topic. So Tolkien had also mentioned a red book, and in this book, C.G. Jung, A Biography in Books, there's a reference to Meyrink, I believe, where he's talking about a cinnabar book. And so it is probable, it seems to me, because of the mythological context, it is probable that Dr. Jung asked for a book with a red cover because it relates to those things. Actually, Tolkien obviously wrote 30 years later than Jung did his red book. But there are references to red books through time. And so I think Dr. Jung intentionally made it the red book for that reason, but I don't think he intended it to be the New Testament. So let's see. Brandon asks, can I tell him about going in as an officer in the Marines? Well, basically, Brandon, you need a college degree, you need at least a C average, and you have to pass some fairly rigorous physical fitness tests. And then if you're accepted, then you undergo a 10 or 12 week OCS program, Officer Candidate School program. If you pass that, then you go to the basic school, which is a 6-month program on basic infantry training for officers. Basically OCS is designed to see if you can handle the pressure of combat, because the whole purpose of being a Marine Corps officer is to lead Marines, and if you're not going to be able to handle that pressure, then you have no business being there. And it happens that about 1/3 of the men and women who go to OCS in the Marine Corps actually depart on their own request because they can't make it. But to give you an order of magnitude about how these things work, at the U.S. Naval Academy, there's a building called Bancroft Hall in which the entire brigade of midshipmen lives. And during your freshman year, your plebe year there, between reveille and taps, if you're a first-year student, you have to run, literally jog down the center of every passageway, and every time you get to a corner, you have to shout, "Go Navy," or "Beat Army," or something of that sort. And when you have 1,100 or 1,200 people doing that all day, every day, it's truly bedlam in there. And that is only one example of the kind of pressures that young people who become Marine and naval officers have to be able to withstand in order to become a basic officer, because we want to know that you can handle yourself in combat. Simple as that. I guess that's about all I can say without interrupting other people's views here. Okay, going back now. Simon Mercurialis is saying Jordan Peterson is trying to be Dr. Jung. To a certain extent, I think that is true. And he's doing a good job of it too. I mean, mostly I agree with him. I don't like him when he goes over the top on the logos, and on order, because I think that we need both logos and eros. And fundamentally, that's the whole debate that has been going on for 2,000 years here. And I think it's one point that he seems to have missed in his 12 Rules of Life. And, I think he's a brilliant psychologist. I think Maps of Meaning is a brilliant book. It's a little bit too tightly packed for me as a layman, but it is certainly a brilliant book on the order of magnitude of some of Dr. Jung's works. And it is, for someone who wants to become a clinical psychologist, I'm sure a great reference book. But my criticism of Dr. Peterson is that in 12 Rules of Life, he went a little bit overboard on logos, and that isn't what Dr. Jung was about throughout his entire lifetime, and his entire oeuvre was about the other side. And in fact, I may be able to get you a quote here quickly. I'm not sure I can, but anyway, his point was that in order to study psychology, he had to give up the scientific method. Here it is. Okay, so this is on page 79 of this book, C.G. Jung, A Biography in Books. So let me just quote what Dr. Shamdasani said and quoted. The title of this section is called Sacrificium Intellectus. And so already in a paper in 1912, Jung had argued that anyone who wanted to get to know the human soul will find out next to nothing from experimental psychology. In a passage that signals a move away from the library and scholarship, he recommended that one, quote, hang up exact science and put away the scholar's gown, to say farewell to his study and wander with human heart through the world, through the horror of prisons, madhouses, and hospitals, through drab suburban pubs, in brothels and gambling dens, through the salons of elegant society, the stock exchanges, the socialist meetings, the churches, the revivals and ecstasies of the sex, to experience love, hate, and passion in every form in one's body. So the entries of the Black Book II in the autumn of 1913 prominently feature a deliberate withdrawal from scholarship, a self-conscious, quote, farewell to science, unquote. On December 30, he noted, all kinds of things lead me far away from my scientific endeavor, which I thought I had subscribed to firmly. I wanted to serve humanity through it, and now, my soul, you lead me to these new things. I feel that a large chunk of science has been broken off. And so this clearly says that Dr. Jung's oeuvre mainly went over to the eros side of the equation as a compensation for the overemphasis on the logos side and on order. That's what Jordan Peterson wants. He wants order against chaos. And it's the chaos that Dr. Jung was talking about. And so Shekinah says, if Trump is the shadow when Jupiter eclipses Saturn in 2022, there's going to be some serious things go down. I can't say about that. I don't know anything about astrology to know that. But Kay says, what is your ethnicity? Are you Scottish? Well, I would say that I'm 57 varieties American. I point with pride back to Dutch ancestors, but they only represent 1/4 of my lineage. We point to them because I can point back to a man who was born in 1588 and who, together with his wife and 3 sons, became 5 of the first 150 citizens of Manhattan Island, and who in his lifetime founded 4 New York cities, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Albany, and Rensselaer. And so I point with pride to him, but he's really only going back 1/4 of my lineage. 1/4 is Swedish from my paternal grandmother, 1/4 Welsh from my maternal grandmother, and 1/4 Pennsylvania Deutsch, Pennsylvania Dutch, which means German, from my maternal grandfather. And so, anyway, for your information, that's sort of irrelevant. I wonder what Shandasani says. Red is an important color in alchemy, also Mercurius color, I believe. Yes, I think that's right. Okay, in Norse mythology, Odin painted the runes red with his blood, and runa, tunes, rune. Yeah, rune. Yeah, I have no doubt. Simon Mercurialis. The reddening in alchemy precedes the illumination. So when you create runes, you have to paint them red according to shamanism. Okay, yeah, that may be, but shamans are like mana personalities, as is discussed in this first reading I did tonight, and so I don't want to overemphasize the magic of shamanism. I mean, people become mana personalities, but it's not necessarily a great achievement unless they are doing something good with it. And I think that there are a lot of charlatans out there. Thomas says, I suspect the new book Appellation just means it was a new book he was working on and had never quite finished or ready for publication before his death. Well, I think the term came from this version of the book. I do acknowledge that it came from this, because there it is. I just don't personally believe that Dr. Jung put that there. I think that that was put there by the people who made the book. And, you know, as I say, if you go into any Barnes and Noble and pick up blank books that you might write your dream journal in or something, you'll often find a title like that on them. And so I think the reference to it as the new book, as if it's the New Testament, I think that's a little bit overblown. That isn't to say that there isn't going to be a religion of psychology built up around Dr. Jung's work. I think that is happening, and it's happening organically, and it has to happen organically. I just don't think that Dr. Jung wanted it to come up because there were believers. I believe, brother. I mean, he wanted people to find it for themselves and to experience it themselves. Obviously, I feel I have, after studying it now for 32 years. And I think a number of you have, because you're still here. But I don't think it was Dr. Jung's intention to have anybody build a religion around that. Rather, he wanted individuals to think for themselves. And obviously this is somewhat what Viktor Frankl was talking about also in his book. And so, okay, says he was into the Bible too, and it could allude to the red thread of Zara. Who knows? I mean, maybe we will never know. You're welcome, Brandon. And Kay says, arrows for the win. Well, we need both. I mean, obviously we need logos. We have some civilization thanks to logos. One of my friends was showing us how pets don't get along when there's food around type thing. And I said, well, okay, be thankful that our human instincts don't just run amok, that we have civilization because of the logos. And so Shakina says light equals order, chaos equals entropy. Well, I don't quite agree with that. Certainly there is chaos in the universe, and we're all dependent upon this planet, which chaotically has all the things we need to live. But I don't think that we should think of chaos as entropy. I think we should think of chaos as our mother, who provided us with all the assets that we needed to not only become formed as creatures, but also all the things we need to have this conversation tonight. And it is order that makes that possible, but it's not necessarily entropy. Certainly entropy, there is entropy in the world or in the universe, and all things tend to disintegrate over time, and some of them should. Thomas says, Stephen Heller and Lance Owens are the only ones I can find who say Jung embossed it on the body of the book. Shamdasani doesn't mention that. That sounds like Heller and Lance Owens, because they have created themselves as a Gnostic church, and one of the two of them is the bishop of the Gnostic church, and so they're literally physically trying to create a church somehow around Gnosticism, not necessarily around Jung's oeuvre, although they're both Jungian analysts. So I'm not very clear what they're trying to do, but I think you are probably right that they're the ones that say that Jung put the Liber Novus on the book. And I'm only resisting that now because has been a tendency to refer to the Red Book as Liber Novus, and I don't think that was Dr. Jung's intention at all. I think his intention was a Cinnabar book or a Red Book. And by the way, throughout his life, it was referred to as the Red Book as it was sitting out on his desk. And Thomas says, it's pretty ridiculous to think Jung wanted the book to start a religion. He would have been horrified at such a suggestion. I think he would have been, yes. And I liked how Frankel mentioned logos, i.e. creating something, and eros, i.e. being in relationship with another, as important in creating meaning in one's world, we need both inputs for balanced meaning. Absolutely, I agree with that, and I really like Viktor Frankl's book for that reason too. And Thomas has listened to some of Heller's audio. I don't think I have, but I've heard him speak a couple of times. What do you think of Avila or Avola? I don't have any thought. I don't know what you're referring to. Or Cinnabar as in Mercury. I think you're talking about some fairly esoteric alchemical ideas there, which I don't claim to be an expert on alchemy, but James Hillman did an excellent about 7-hour talk on alchemy and Jungian psychology, which I recommend that you download from audible.com, and you can listen to that. And Shakina says Odin is also Mercury. Well, for me, those mentions of those things, those kind of just leave me cold unless I know how they connect up with anything. And, as I experience them in the writing, then they have meaning for me. But when we just throw terms around, it doesn't mean anything. So I'll give you, as I've said many times, the Bible is just is a black book with a lot of printing in it, very small printing, and a very effective doorstop until you put life into it, until you actually read it and connect it up and see what it means to your own life and how you react to it. And so that's what I've been doing with Dr. Jung's work for 32 years, as I say. And, over that time, I've been connecting it up. Give you an example, as I read Psychology and Alchemy about a decade ago now, at least, I came to understand that what Dr. Jung was writing, and actually I came across it here in Shamdasani's book this morning, was he was writing a history of the human mind. And since I was a history major in college, I like history. And so, but when I started to read Psychology and Alchemy, I had no clue what I was getting into, but what I came to at the end of it was that it is a history of the human mind, or at least a history of the human mind in the West. And so that makes it very interesting and very useful, but just throwing names or ideas out doesn't really connect with me unless you explain it. And so Kay says Julius Evola, I don't know that name at all, and Egregoras, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so somehow you need to either communicate what your meaning is and what you're trying to refer to in the chat, or you need to write to me separately, and I'll see if I can get into what the point you're trying to make. But right now, all I'm seeing is a bunch of words. So Thomas says, I have a question. Okay, I'm here for you, Thomas. Thank you for supporting me earlier. I'm happy to answer your question, or maybe it's Kay you want to ask. Let's see. Okay, we have about 10 more minutes left on this session. Okay. You mentioned Jungian analysis as being golly gee people. No, I didn't mean that. But I'll explain what I meant. But I'm unsure what you mean by that exactly, that they throw out the word archetype and go golly gee archetypes. No, what I meant is not Jungian analysts, because Jungian analysts are no doubt deeply into Jungian psychology, so I don't call them golly gee people. The people I call golly gee people are maybe we would call them newbies who have read, some piece of Jungian psychology. I mean, maybe Man and His Symbols or something like that, and they say, oh, wow, or even more so. I mean, I was like this, so I acknowledge it. When I read Women Who Run with the Wolves, I was really impressed by the ideas that Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Dr. Estes, put in her book. And so I was saying to myself, golly gee, and as I have explained before, that lit me off on a visioning experience that lasted 8 months. So, golly gee, I didn't know what it meant. I had to take that novel and put it in my drawer for 21 years before I could explain it. And so that's what I mean by a golly gee person, somebody that has just been exposed to Jungian psychology and something archetypal has connected, and they go, wow, this is really for me. And they haven't really gotten into the depth of it yet. So I don't mean that about Jungian analysts. They definitely have gotten into the depth of it, no doubt. And so Brandon says, what is your favorite period in history? I love, I suppose, ancient Roman history. What is my favorite period of history? Well, I guess if you're asking me that today, I guess I would have to say the history of Dr. Jung's life is very interesting as you get into reading his work and can see when these various topics fell into his work and when he started to talk about various things and put those in the context of where he was in his writing career. That to me right now is very interesting. When I was much younger, when I was in college, I was very interested in Asian history because I had lived in Japan for 3 years in high school, and so I was very focused on Asian history at that time, and to include Indian history and so on. I was just so about European history, but now that I've gotten into Dr. Jung's work and seen his history of the mind, which is contained in all of his books about alchemy and in Ion, then that becomes very interesting. I think that historians have missed that whole facet of history and how the human mind has developed and been overwhelmed in many cases. I mean, if you look at the 20th century, as Jordan Peterson points out, and Dr. Jung points out, we were overwhelmed as a species by psychic epidemics. And I think that right now there could be nothing more important than getting us to understand what a psychic epidemic is and how it can influence us and how we can control it. And I mean, just think of the tragedy that exists in the Muslim world where, sons, let's say mostly sons, are committing suicide because they think that that's going to get them to 72 virgins. Oh my God. Who came up with that idea? Somebody that wanted power and wanted other people to die for their beliefs, certainly. But, if we don't understand, and if we can't get our fellow men to understand that Dr. Jung was right when he said in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, I'll say it again, religious statements are, without exception, religious statements are statements of the psyche and not statements of the physical world. And if we think of just the implications of that sentence, it is enormous because, fundamentalist Christians want you to believe that everything in the Bible was physically true. And it clearly isn't and wasn't. And it even says so in the Bible. I mean, if you look at a lot of the major events of the Bible, they occur in dreams and visions, which are all psychic events. They are not physical events. And so that's, those sorts of things are huge. And so if we could just help our fellow men understand that one point that Dr. Jung made in his career, that's going to do a lot to bring peace on earth, just that. So let's see. So cases, yeah, and Thomas says, golly gee, and go no deeper. Yeah, that's what I mean. Also, Dr. Jung was not very interested in people until they were already past their midlife crisis or in their midlife crisis. Then they became interesting to him. Kay says, this is a good book on Logos versus Eros, Ring of Power, Symbols and Themes, Love versus Power in Wagner's Ring Cycle, and in Jungian Feminist Perspective, Jung on the Hudson book series. Yeah, those are good books, and there's a Jungian analyst in Toronto who has a Twitter feed called Sophia Cycles, and I've put a playlist of some of the videos that she's made on this YouTube channel that's worth looking at. It's called Sophia Cycles, but she's talking about Wagner's Ring Cycle, and what she's using is actual performance art and talking about what those things mean. So it's really a worthwhile series that she's done. Thomas says, I understand, I think. You hear one thing and you kind of get lost in it without reading more fully. I suppose I've been guilty of that past decades. Well, I think that Dr. Jung's point of view is that we circumambulate the center. And as we do that, we go deeper and deeper and deeper. I mean, I'm finding as I'm looking back at books that I've read several times, I'm finding things that I never found before. And I've obviously been getting very deeply into these things, so I'm still finding new things. And so I don't think it's I think that we absorb what we're capable of absorbing at the time, but Jung's work doesn't yield itself up by reading it like a novel, that's for sure. And so, in terms of my comment about the golly gee people is, well, okay, they're on their first time through and they think it's neat, then come back and see me when you're on your fifth time through, and then we can have a chat. So Thomas says, my therapist was very interested in a dream I had where Dr. Jung was present. I tried to paint it but failed. I think it tied into the idea of quaternity. Interesting. It was several decades ago when I was much younger. I was sitting cross-legged in the backyard of my parents' home at night when Dr. Jung and two women in a little circle, we passed a joint around. Okay, I don't comment on other people's dreams, so I'm not a mental health professional, and I try to avoid commenting on the dreams of others. So I'll leave it to you to comment. Kay says the 72 versions are nothing without Eros. Absolutely. And, when you live in a society that doesn't allow contact between men and women, I can tell you, I've been to Saudi Arabia 23 times since 2002. And each time I go for about 2 weeks. But when I've been in Saudi Arabia, you don't see women around, or if you see a woman, she's entirely covered with a black sheet, actually called an abaya, and her hair is covered, and so the feminine principle is simply absent in Saudi Arabia. And I know when even just going out from Riyadh to Dubai and landing in the airport and seeing women, all kinds of women in the airport in Dubai, I physically react to it. I say, oh, that's a woman. And it's because I've been entirely deprived of the feminine principle in my life for that 2-week period. So for an Arab man or a Muslim man who's been deprived of access to the feminine principle, I can't imagine what that must be like. And so I'm sure a lot of them feel frustrated enough to say, well, God, if you say I can get 72 virgins if I just kill myself, man, I'm in. I can imagine how that works. Let's see. And Thomas went on, that was it. She said he represented the wise old man archetype to a degree. The foreignness was important in 2 males along with 2 females. Yep, I can certainly believe that. Shekina says, that is why the Bible teaches us not to follow the heart. The heart can be darkened. Kill a man's wife or kids and he will kill himself to take you down regardless. Truth is subjective to the situation. Yep, I believe that. Okay, so truth is objective, but our ability to discern it is not that. That's why justice is blind. I'm not quite sure the point there. Thomas says the book looks interesting. Okay, it sounds cool. Shekina, dreambible.com is quite Jungian in approach. I think that any written dream discussion Dr. Jung would discourage. Even the Book of Symbols, which I have shown on various occasions, which was written by Jungian analysts, you cannot predict what a symbol means in another person's psyche. That's just not possible, at least from Dr. Jung's point of view, which I've adopted as my own. Thomas says, it was curious to have dreamed of a thinker who felt dreams to be so important. Dream happened many, many years ago. I had only begun to read Jung at the time. Answer to Job and Dreams Memories. Well, I think that, Dr. Jung can influence you with very early. I mean, Jordan Peterson made this comment on one of his videos that Dr. Jung will rewire your circuits or something to that effect. And I acknowledge that that can happen very early in exposure to Dr. Jung's work. And, it's the answer is buckle up, because it's not going to get easier. And Thomas says, the Book of Symbols is good reading just to open up and peruse, not using it to interpret anything. Yeah, precisely. Because I did a dream reading from my book one time where it was when I had been diagnosed that I needed a knee replacement. And so I read for the group the interpretation from a Jungian point of view of the word knee. And then I had a dream about my knee, and none of the symbols in the book appeared there. And instead, my knee was one of the people in the group. And so you just can't predict how these symbols will affect you. So anyway, okay. Thomas says, my understanding of his work post-60 is much different than what my younger self found, but this is true of many books I reread. That doesn't surprise me at all. And, you could be flippant and say that Jungian studies is wasted on the young. I think that you need a certain amount of world experience, life experience, before you appreciate what he is doing for you, and opening up your psyche to different points of view, let's say. And and how do you deal with that? I mean, I wish I could tell you some of my experiences in Saudi Arabia, but it would be improper for me to do so. And so I'm being very guarded in what I say about it. But and mind you, I only worked in the hospital industry, and not in any other strange industry that some people may think. But nonetheless, there are observations that you can't help but having when you're there. And so Thomas says, I suppose younger people might ask, who should we read? Those of us in our 20s and 30s. Well, I would say read all the great novels that you can and see all the movies. I would go back and see every Academy Award-winning movie from the beginning of moviedom, because you're going to learn a lot from that. And I think that the way we're educating young people these days has to be through video, because people don't have the time to sit and read something like this. Who's going to pick this up? I mean, as Edinger says, it's quite a tome. And it certainly is. And so the only way young people are going to learn is through video means or audio means. And so I think audiobooks are very good, and I've been listening to them for 30 years. I think there's a Irving Stone book called Fire in the Mind, which is a historical novel about the life of Freud, which is very interesting. I read it on Audible about 30 years ago, and I highly recommend you trying to find that and listen to that. That's a good book. And if you get into Irving Stone, then I'd also read Greek Treasure, which is a book about the life of Heinrich Schliemann and his wife. And Schliemann was a man who had earned a fortune during the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century. But he had a lifelong ambition to excavate Troy, the city of Troy. And he did that. And he also excavated Mycenae in Greece and found many golden masks and many other treasures. And because Schliemann was a German, half of what he found went to the Greek people, and the other half he sent to the Berlin Museum. And unfortunately, the half that was sent to the Berlin Museum was melted down by the Nazis. And I had hoped to see the Greek half of the treasure when I was in Athens back when the Olympics occurred. But unfortunately, I was there when the museum was closed. They had closed it in preparation for the Olympics, and so I never got to see them. Maybe someday. Joseph Campbell's a great thing to do. I agree with that, Thomas. And in fact, I spent the whole decade of the 90s reading Joseph Campbell. And, I think he's excellent. I had an interest in mythology for a long time, but I didn't know why. I mean, my high school, senior year in high school, my English teacher had us read Edith Wharton's book, Mythology or Ancient Mythology or something like that. But he never connected it up very well to what's happening with us in our lives. But I was always somewhat interested in it. And, I'm sorry. The Irving Stone book about Freud's life is not Fire in the Mind. The Fire in the Mind is the biography of Joseph Campbell, which is excellent, and I highly urge you to read that. In fact, I read it while driving through North Carolina physically with a book on the steering wheel, reading the book and going through North Carolina. How I survived, I'll never know, but I do remember that's how I read that book. And it's called, the book is called Fire in the Mind, and that's literally a biography of Joseph Campbell. So that's a great place to start with Campbell, because then you know where he's coming from. But then his series, well, there's the Hero with 1,000 Faces, which won him a Book of the Month Club award or something like that. And then his 4-volume series on the Masks of God, which he spent 12 years handwriting on his dining room table or his kitchen table. He had a 2-room apartment in New York with his wife, Jean Erdman, and he spent 12 years writing The Masks of God, which is very good. Especially, I highly recommend Volume 4, which is about creative mythology. That's a very, very important book. And so I urge you to take a look at that. And I do agree with Thomas that you should look at the books from which the movies derive, because obviously they're much more complete, let's say, than the movies are. The movies are just a dance across the high points in most cases. And Thomas is saying Lust for Life and Agony in the Ecstasy. These are both Irving Stone books, very good books. And I don't know, maybe I can find the book about Freud here if I look quickly. I was looking at it just recently again because I thought maybe I should read this thing again. Let me just see if I can find it on Amazon here. So I put it in as Irving, The Passions of the Mind, that's the one. Okay, it's The Passions of the Mind, a novel of Sigmund Freud by Irving Stone. And I'm pretty sure you can get it in Audible. You'll have to check that because the version I heard on Audible was actually a tape that I got years ago. Passions of the Mind, though. And Thomas says, and Campbell is available in video, an interview with Bill Moyers, absolutely. And also he wrote Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, which is a very interesting book, very good book. So anyway, I think we better wrap it up here, but it's been an interesting conversation tonight, and I wish you well. Let's see, is it next week that's Christmas? Next week is Christmas Eve. So there will not be another Monday evening session until after the first of the year. So it will be the 7th of January will be the next meeting of this group. And so I apologize for that, but next week is Christmas Eve and the following week is New Year's Eve. And so I don't know if we'd have many folks. And Christmas Eve, I know I'm booked, and New Year's Eve, I'm probably booked too. So the next meeting, I'll put it in the chat too, is January 7, 2019. So I will, but in the interim, I will endeavor to do some more readings. And so, as you know, I can be persuaded to catch as catch can in the context of my readings. If you haven't read The Undiscovered Self, I read that in 7 sessions in the last couple of weeks, and so they are high on the pile of videos, and so I highly recommend those. That'll really confuse you. And So anyway, I'll excuse myself for tonight. So nice seeing you all, and I hope to see you between now and January 7th, but there will be no official meeting of the group until the 7th of January. And there is still one advanced reading group meeting, and that is this Wednesday, the 19th, at 1:30 p.m. on Wednesday. So if you're not a member of the advanced reading group, please send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will add you if you fulfill our requirements. And in any case, I will add you to the regular reading group Dropbox, which is quite comprehensive. This is the 108th session of this group, believe it or not. And so there is quite a rich amount of information in the Dropbox, as well as in the over 800 videos that I've done since